Welcome back to another explainer. Today, we're going to do something a little bit different. We are moving far past the traditional history books to look at a historical figure you definitely recognize, but we're going to uncover exactly how she built the modern blueprint for activism. I'm talking, of course, about Eleanor Roosevelt. Our source material today is a comprehensive academic analysis of her enduring influence, and it proves that her legacy is just so much more than what we were taught in school. Okay, let's dive into this. Historically, the role of the First Lady was, largely ceremonial. It was strictly domestic and fundamentally passive. The role was really about hosting state dinners, not shaping state policy. But Eleanor's approach? It was a stark contrast. It was active, highly public, and fiercely reform-driven. She didn't just tweak the role, she completely disrupted the system and redefined what it meant to hold that office, using it to challenge the prevailing norms of her era.
So, to digest all this fascinating academic source material today, we're going to look at four thematic pillars of her legacy. First, redefining the First Lady. Second, architect of social justice. Third, drafting global human rights. And finally, championing democratic values. Let's get right into it.
Section 1. Redefining the First Lady. Building a true platform for reform.
You've probably heard that Eleanor famously became the eyes and ears of President Franklin D. Roosevelt. But think about what that actually meant during the brutal economic hardships of the Great Depression. She didn't just sit in a comfortable office in Washington. No way. She ventured right out into coal mines, sharecropper shacks, and urban slums. And crucially, she leveraged the emerging media of her time, specifically radio and her widely read syndicated newspaper column, My Day, to broadcast these struggles directly to the public. By doing this, she humanized the presidency and made the government feel accessible to everyday citizens who were, quite frankly, desperately struggling to survive. Now, what's really interesting about this slide is how these deeply empathetic actions map so perfectly onto modern sociological concepts. By actively engaging with all these diverse communities, Eleanor was building invaluable social capital and trust. She essentially became this vital intermediary, taking the desperate needs of marginalized groups and conveying them to the highest levels of government. In doing so, she expanded the public sphere, the national discourse, to include voices that had historically been completely shut out of the conversation. Moving on to Section 2, Architect of Social Justice, and how she championed the marginalized. Consider this absolute masterclass in tactical activism. When the Daughters of the American Revolution refused to let Marian Anderson, a brilliant African-American contralto, perform at Constitution Hall simply because of her race, Eleanor didn't just disagree in private. She resigned from the organization in a highly visible public protest. Then she used her immense leverage to facilitate Anderson's iconic concert right at the Lincoln Memorial. This wasn't just a concert, it was a devastatingly effective, highly public condemnation of institutionalized racial prejudice. She used her massive platform to spotlight hypocrisy and really galvanize civil rights support nationwide. And her thinking was just so deeply integrated and well ahead of her time. The sources point out how her historical actions actually align with several modern academic frameworks. Her civil rights advocacy, like fighting for anti-lynching laws, aligns closely with critical race theory and intersectionality, recognizing the intersection of racial and economic bias. Her fight for labor rights, fair wages, and worker organization echoes Marxist critiques of capitalism, demanding a safety net and protections against unchecked corporate power. And her push for women's empowerment aligns perfectly with liberal feminism. She intuitively grasped the systemic interconnectedness of these issues decades before the modern academic vocabulary even existed. Okay, Section 3, Drafting Global Human Rights, Laying the Foundation. So, as the chair of the UN Human Rights Commission, Eleanor faced this truly monumental task of bridging incredibly deep ideological divides among diverse nations that were all recovering from a global trauma. To do this, she grounded her pragmatic diplomacy in natural law philosophy. That's the Enlightenment ideal that certain rights are inherent to all individuals simply by virtue of their humanity. Anchoring complex negotiations in this universal idealism allowed her to navigate some intense political minefields and build unprecedented consensus among nations with wildly different cultural, political, and religious backgrounds. And this brilliantly illustrates the expansiveness of her vision. Her work on the Universal Declaration of Human Rights wasn't just a basic list of civil liberties. She fought hard to ensure the document encompassed civil, political, economic, social, and cultural rights.
She understood that you cannot have true human dignity if you only have the right to vote and speak freely, but you lack the right to a fair wage, education, or economic security. She made sure that social well-being was recognized internationally as a fundamental, interconnected human right.
Which brings us to Section 4, championing democratic values, looking at Eleanor as a public intellectual. Roosevelt's core democratic tenets relied heavily on civic education, open dialogue, and government accountability. During an era that saw the terrifying rise of propaganda and global demagoguery, Eleanor used her extensive writings, like her My Day column, to actively educate the public. She passionately argued that a healthy republic relies entirely on informed, questioning, and engaged citizens. And she modeled this too. She openly engaged in respectful discourse with people she completely disagreed with, and she consistently demanded that citizens hold their government accountable. Democracy to her wasn't just a concept, it was a living embodiment of shared values and collective civic responsibility. Eleanor Roosevelt really expanded the boundaries of her prescribed role to change the world. She took a purely ceremonial position and turned it into an absolute engine for systemic reform and global human dignity. So what does this all mean for us? Well, I want to leave you with this question. How are you using your platform today? Whether your platform is your workplace, your local community, or your digital network, her legacy proves that profound influence isn't bound by traditional titles. It's driven by conviction and action. Thank you so much for joining me for this explainer, and I really hope this leaves you inspired to examine your own civic responsibility. Catch you next time.